I'm Steve Wiggins, and this is the Groundworks Ministries podcast. Today we're reading the book of 2 Samuel, chapter 1. Let's focus on verses 11 and 12. Then David took hold of his clothes, and he tore them, and all of the men with him did the same. They mourned, wept, and fasted until the evening for those who died by the sword, for Saul, his son, Jonathan, the Lord's people, and the house of Israel. Now, verses 11 and 12 are at the center of today's chapter. Having gone through intense trauma over the past 7 chapters, David and his men had reached their emotional limits. Now, there was no other option but to mourn, and to do so loudly and dramatically. Upon reading the events of 2 Samuel chapter 1, you find yourself wanting to skip to verse 10, the end of the Amalekites' account of Saul's death. And then you want to go directly to verse 13, the execution of that Amalekite. But the writer seems to think that the most important item in the story is the grief and the wailing of David and his men over Israel's fallen leaders and their soldiers. The Lord's people have been crushed, and grief cannot wait. In deciding to focus on the grief first, instead of the quick justice, the writer has exposed a basic human tendency in all of us, and that tendency is to hurry grief instead of letting it take its natural course. The grief of David and his men is impressive. The condition of God's people disturbed them. They felt things. You don't think about this in soldiers. And in this account, we could all learn a lesson about empathy for suffering of other believers. Furthermore, after that initial grief and the necessary justice, David begins the process of lamenting. Grief remains long after the events grieved have passed. But change, can happen swiftly, and it often does. Change happens. You're riding along on your motorcycle and bam, you hit something in the road, and the next thing you know, you wake up in a hospital. It happens so fast. So change happens swiftly. Transition is how we internalize the change that has happened. And people don't just snap out of it like we want them to. Sorrow is a process, and it must take its time. Though grief abides, it eventually subsides if you don't try to stuff it down. And the fact that grief subsides means that God's people have hope to get through even the midst of great trauma. Grief moves toward healing. And David chose the lament, which is a song by which Israel could pour out their mourning and perhaps learn a few lessons. 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 17 and 18. David sang the following lament for Saul and his son Jonathan, and he ordered that the Judahites be taught the song of the bow. It is written in the book of Jashar, 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 17 and 18. Now, we don't know what the book of Jashar is, probably lost long ago, but at least we know that it was written. A lament is a formal expression of grief or distress. And one can be written, read, learned, and repeated. A lament differs from the informal, spontaneous, immediate outbursts of grief that are associated with your initial response to the news of a tragedy. The lament is no less sorrowful or sincere, though. It is a vehicle for the mind as well as for the emotions. A lament is thoughtful grief. The intensity of one's emotions, combined with the discipline of the mind, produces structured sorrow. It's kind of funny, you think about it, structured sorrow, and that's exactly what it is. It allows the emotions, but it also processes the thoughts. It's a sort of authorized version of a response to distress, a coherent agony. Sometimes Christians are impatient with grief. Why can't they just trust God and get over it? Well, most people who say that, they only say it selfishly because they don't want to sit and lament with somebody else. They don't want to go through it with them. They don't want to patiently wait for them to get through what could be a lengthy process. So today, perhaps, God is teaching you to embrace the discipline of expressing grief in words, of song or prose even, which convey your anguish and verbalize despondency. I'm Steve Wiggins, and this is the Groundworks Ministries podcast. Remember, life may seem out of control at times. Remembering God has a great plan and that He has infinite power to effect His plan is the only way that we can get through life. Groundworks Ministries operates entirely through financial donations from faithful people like you. And if you're being ministered to through the Bible teaching of Groundworks Ministries, and you'd like to help us reach this generation with the gospel, would you consider donating to Groundworks Ministries today? Donating is secure and easy at our website. Check us out at groundworksministries.com.